All right, let me just introduce Dr. Justin Phillips. Dr. Justin Phillips is a recent AOMA grad from Austin, Texas, and he will be presenting on post-natal essence neurogenesis and neuroplasticity in Chinese medicine. And that was done via scoping study.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to speak in such august company. It's been a pleasure to listen to everyone this morning. I feel like this presentation is salient and somewhat timely. In Dr. Greaves' speech, a question was asked about sort of integration of the classics with modern information and how do the classics remain relevant to that. And that concept has come up a couple times, and that was really the principal focus of the work that I did. Let me go ahead and pop up. We'll share some screen here. Boom, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about neuroplasticity and neurogenesis here in East Asian medicine to familiarize you with sort of the, come on now. Let me see if I can. Trying to, there we go. Okay. So the purpose behind the original research project, which as Dr. Sodders mentioned, was conducted at the AOMA Graduate School of Integrative Medicine in Austin, Texas, which, by the way, my current position, that was done about 5 years ago. My current position is I'm the academic dean for Texas Health and Science University in Austin and San Antonio. And have continued to push into research a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But that original research project conducted as my doctoral dissertation for that doctorate from AOMA, like I said, about 5 years ago now, was a systematic search and review and scoping study with the goal to combine modern biomedical information with East Asian medicine ontology. And this really speaks, I think, to what Dr. Greaves mentioned in that in response to that question, that there is a need to lean into the classics. Our medicine has a very rich history, cultural background, and sort of epistemic evolution. And it's critical that we maintain that lest we cease to be what we are. And I think that in the spectrum of the modern research, as we're discussing today, and more in the broader profession, there is sort of a challenge of how do we hold on to that ontology and that epistemic tradition while still giving credibility to the modern objective information. You know, for instance, if we can see something on an fMRI, we can't turn around and deny its existence because it doesn't necessarily fit with classical literature. There is a need to integrate those two, but I think there is a space that we can do that without sacrificing our own language and traditions in and around that. And so the goal of this was to look at a place where I could start to try to create an interface between classical concepts and a more immediate neurophysiological and biomedical understanding of the systems that we were looking at. And the place that I chose to do that, as you can tell from the title of my presentation, was in and around neurology, neuroplasticity, and neurogenesis. And there were sort of two parts to the original research process, and one was the ontological comparison. What are the concepts and language available via modern research and neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, and how can I compare those to the classical language and classical theorems? Where can I take that modern information and place it effectively into the spectrum of the classics so that it makes sense? And once I try to make that comparison, it's not enough to simply say, well, this sounds like that. There then has to be a question of how do I create a validity to that? Again, as Dr. Greaves mentioned, there has to be some sort of testing procedure. Otherwise, I could make all sorts of claims. Because the classics, certainly having experienced multiple translations and an almost endless number of commentaries, are open to a lot of interpretation. So I could simply interpret them my own way and then declare myself correct. So the second part was to look at the current research that was available that would compare specifically acupuncture and herbal treatments on neurological disorders and say, would these treatments affect the systems that I'm describing? And is the outcome of the treatments consistent with what I would expect based on my current hypothesis? sort of similar to the black box theory with which all medical diagnostic and differentiation is practiced. We don't know what's going on in the body, but if we have a clear picture of what treatment input we are creating and we see the treatment outcomes on the other end, we can make some determinations about diagnostically what's happening in the patient system itself. And I sort of used the modern research with that same black box mentality. If I have a theorem about what's going on and I look at the input and the output, do they verify what I think I'm seeing? So to sort of define some terms along the way, for those of you that may or may not be as familiar with some of the neurophysiology that we're describing, there are two processes in general that I was looking at. I was looking at neurogenesis, which is the creation of new neurological tissue anywhere in the body, but specifically in the brain itself. And neuroplasticity, which is the process of the remapping of neural connections in order to create new neuronal architecture for the purposes of memory, learning, novel exploration, and things like that. And this comes into play both in positive aspects such as learning and negative aspects such as PTSD, which we just heard about so wonderfully not that terribly long ago. And these are both concepts that in and of themselves have seen a lot of movement in the last few decades. Up until really even the late 80s and early 90s, there was sort of an operative theory that neuroplasticity and particularly neurogenesis were both things that occurred predominantly in very young children and developing children and teenagers, and that really once you hit adulthood, there's a relatively limited aptitude of the neurophysiology to make any significant changes, sort of the can't teach an old dog new tricks mentality. But more modern neurological research began to reveal a fairly active process of neuroplastic change going on in the brain, and even to a limited degree, continued neurogenesis, particularly in a few fairly specific parts of the brain and its anatomy. But we are still developing neuronal tissue, and we are certainly remapping neural tissue. And in fact, more and more, and this comes to some of the relevant importance of the research, we're discovering that a maintenance of neuroplastic aptitude has a profound long-term downstream impact on recovery from neurodegenerative disease, traumatic brain injury, neural insult from such things as tumor resections, and even just long-term neurological health. People that maintain improved neuroplastic aptitude have a decreased incidence of things like Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. Really very much a process of you use it or lose it. And that more modern research revealed that these things are still very active processes, which really is what allowed me to start to incorporate the more functional medicine approach of the holism of East Asian medicine and layer those onto these processes and say, okay, well, if this is an ongoing process and we can typify processes in the body via their functional manifestations and outcome measures into the functional processes of East Asian medicine and our own language and ontology, how do I make an effort to describe these things? And this was a lot of nail biting and a lot of hair pulling. Tears were shed, voices were raised. But along the way, what I arrived at was a handful of things. And as you can tell from the overall title of this particular presentation, I arrived at the idea that perhaps postnatal essence was a good way to lay hands on these neurogenic, neuroplastic, and overall neuronal processes in and around the brain. And what I'm going to talk about now is a little bit of how I got there. And if there's a little bit of time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about where I've gone from there, because like I said, this was 5 years ago. And it is never quiet in my head, so work has continued to be done. So essence in the brain, why do I go there? There were a couple places where I started to see this intersection pretty extensively between the classics and what I saw in the modern medical processes. One, obviously, is the connection to the kidneys. The kidneys are seen as the storehouse of essence, both pre and postnatal via the classics. The kidneys are also typified as in command of the marrow. In terms of body substances and their relationship to Zongfu organs. And of course, the sea of the marrow is via the classics terminology for the brain itself. And so this relationship to the kidneys and essence and marrow and the sea of marrow all creates an idea that we could create a relationship via a little bit of semantic chicanery into a relationship between the kidneys and essence and this sea of marrow. From there, we could also see the decline of essence, pre and postnatal, which of course is a part of the aging process. As we age, there's an idea that the Jing wanes. Some of the more extensive aspects of our medicine, particularly when you look at some of the lifestyle processes, Qigong practices, Neigong practices, things like that, the goal is to protect the essence, because when the essence declines, we begin to age. And one of the things that we see with aging is a related cognitive decline. So via this relationship with the kidneys and essence and marrow, we could look at this age-related cognitive decline as an element of the waning of essence pre and postnatal. And if we look particularly at the postnatal essence in relation to ongoing neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, we could look at, and I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, we could look at that maintenance of postnatal essence, because of course in the classical concept you can't really replenish prenatal essence, but you can replenish postnatal essence in some philosophies in order to protect the prenatal essence. And we can look at some of those processes that protect that postnatal and build that postnatal essence and their effect on long-term cognitive decline. And that again starts to relate essence back to this idea of long-term neuronal health and neurological functioning. Lastly, we can look at essence as fundamental patterning, and this comes back to some of the fundamental Taoist concepts, the Ming-Men fire, its continued relationships with the kidneys. Our essence is particularly our prenatal essence. In some interpretations of the classics has been typified as our genetics. And I would then extrapolate that, and not I alone, would continue that theory into epigenetics as an element of postnatal essence. Not only our fundamental patterning, but then how our environment, our diet, and our lifestyle influence not just the presence of our genes, but the expression of those genes through the protein synthesis processes, which now, as we know, in terms of long-term potentiation via neuronal pathways, long-term potentiation has a lot to do with immediate gene expression, IgE processes, and then the intermediate protein synthesis processes created by epigenetic switching in order to create that long-term gene expression in neuronal functions, which then affects neurotransmitter output and things like that. So there is this underlying genetic fundamental patterning component, which a lot of commentators have tied back into genetics and essence. So again, we see this pull back towards essence as this process of ongoing neuronal creation and patterning via neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, as that neuroplasticity in particular is impacted by that long-term potentiation and that creation of new synapse connections and synapse processes to create this, excuse me, long-standing neuronal architecture that impacts then our overall neuronal functioning. We can also not just look at essence as a core concept, but we can step that over and look at, again, our 5-phase cycle and the accumulation cycle, and particularly the creation cycle within that. And here I'm going to start a little bit with the earth phase, in that we have that earth phase aspect of intake and gathering. The earth is where the seed is planted. And of course, if we tie that into our zong fu function, or even our channel system function, we have our intake of our spleen and stomach system, that is our digestive intake. That then, of course, is responsible within the qi creation cycle for the accumulation of postnatal qi, which, when well cultivated, can then help support postnatal essence in that process of ongoing support. That then feeds into the metal cycle, which is a process of accretion and descent. The metal phase by its nature moves inward and downward, the lungs capturing, gathering, and descending of qi into the kidneys for the grasping of that. And there we see, and we'll see on my next slide, I'll talk a little bit about neurogenesis versus neuroplasticity. That metal phase then begins that process of neuronal gathering and creation via the aminos, proteins, ATP produced by that earth phase, which allows neuronal functioning, long-term potentiation, and neuronal patterning, which then is stored in the brain, which then comes back to the sea of marrow and that essence control of the water phase in the kidneys. Then, of course, that water phase, that water which nourishes the wood, then allows for the neuroplastic patterning of our visualization processes, our cognitive processes, our planning processes, which then allow for a day-to-day neuronal functioning and firing, which allows us to then interact with the world around us. And that then, in contrast to the metal phases, descent and contraction, we then move into the wood phase with its rising and spreading limbs, like the tree of the wood phase. And that then is going to be that rising and spreading, which, that general directionality and direction even mirrors the imagery of a lot of neuronal architecture, in that we have these axons that then move out into synaptic trees that then feed into the root-like dendritic trees of neighboring neurons across that synaptic cleft. So there's an almost visual allegory for this wood phase in these synaptic connections that form within these neuroplastic changes. Okay. So looking at that process in sort of a more gathered phase, we have this process of neurogenesis, which is going to be a metabolic intake, physical activity and experiences that are going to gather to create hippocampal patterning, which can then, of course, influence overall neurologic changes in patterning, which then will be stored in the brain. Certainly in the hippocampal area specifically, also in some of the thalamic and hypothalamic areas to modify overall signal cycling, and then just generally as broader neurological patterning. Although most of the neurogenesis that occurs in one of two places, most of our neural stem cells exist predominantly in the olfactory bulb, as well as in the hippocampus. And what we see is that olfactory bulb, of course, the nose and our sense of smell is tied back into the lung zong fu, which is, of course, related to the metal phase. So we see these neurogenic systems tied into that metal phase again. And we know from research from all the way back when I was in elementary school, my elementary school science fair was about, does smelling strong smells make your memory better? And as it turns out, it does. That wasn't pioneering research when I was in elementary school. I already knew the answer, but it was elementary school research. But I created a study to essentially retest that. Because the olfactory bulb has a strong impact on hippocampal retention, because those neural stem cells in those two areas work together to create neurogenic tissue to create more imprinted memories. What we also know is memories with strong physiological components have a greater impact on learning and memory retention. This is why, in terms of maintaining long-term neuroplasticity, they recommend things like Tai Chi, like ballroom dancing, and like juggling, because that strong physical proprioceptive activation increases neurogenic production and improves long-term neuroplastic output. Once we've got this neural storage, we then move into the neuroplastic of the wood phase. We know that visualization exercises will actually remap the neural architecture in the same way that actual physical activities will help the neurogenic process. And of course, the wood phase, related to the liver, related to the eyes, is about visualization and planning. The wood phase is the plan. It's the seed that has the map for the entire oak tree. And so this planning and novel learning increases neuroplastic patterning. And so we see this process of neurogenesis through the accretion of the metal phase, the gathering of that metabolic intake via the earth phase into memory storage within the water phase that then expands into the ability to now synaptically map these learned processes into novel learning attitudes and long-term potentiation in a neuroplastic aspect. And all of that happens via that essence process of post-natal essence storage, which allows both a place for that accretion of the water phase to be held more long-term than post-natal chi, which is utilized within the channel system more immediately, but then can be used later via the wood phase's utilization of the water phase in order to create these ongoing learning processes. I have noted over here on the left the earth as working memory. Working memory is something that in the cognitive and memory communities is a little bit of a sticky wicket, because working memory is something that is relatively ill-defined, but working memory is considered as sort of that initial intake of information. There's an idea. The reason phone numbers are 7 digits long and chunked into a 3 and 4 digit number is because within the working memories, those are sort of the chunked categories that you can hold on to the best. And working memory is that very, very short-term memory that then with process can be imprinted into the longer memory storage. And that very much, again, because if we remember the processes of physiological versus shin versus emotion, everything, none of those are really separate. So that physical intake, when I eat food, it is intake, there is an intake and breakdown to chi and move to essence. That process is the same. And that's why the earth phase is relevant here. The research studies that I found once I had built that ontological structure to say, okay, is this true? In the acupuncture studies, what I found looking at neurogenesis and neuroplasticity was that they were mostly animal trials. They used relatively limited point selection. There was relatively little diagnosis in relation to these studies, and it was typically in relation to induced pathologies. Similar to the herbal studies, it was mostly animal trials and mostly in induced pathologies. What we found was looking at studies around neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, they were rarely in relation to the treatment of improved neurogenesis or neuroplasticity in healthy subjects, but was largely related to in relation to induced trauma is ischemias in the brain or hemorrhagic induction in cerebral tissue. Could we then trigger neuroplastic repatterning or compensation or create an improved presence of neurogenesis for recovery from trauma? And because of that, a lot of the research was utilizing, there was a lot of chi tonic points and herbs used. There were some, particularly in the herbal medicine, a number of herbs that were related to the kidneys and to essence formation, particularly Shu Di Huang was a frequent inclusion, but a lot of it was more around qi and blood stagnation regulation, qi and blood movement, because they were looking at induced traumas, which of course we know that an induced trauma intrinsically has an element of qi and blood stagnation. And so a lot of that research was around, can we, in the wake of a trauma, induce an improvement? So really the conclusions of the initial study was that the connections I could draw were limited. The theoretical foundations are solid. And based on a number of the people that I spoke to, there was a validity to the lit review component, both from the standpoint of the classics and the research, but unfortunately most of the testing focused not on healthy production of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, but on treating precursor steps. Could we restore healthy qi production and qi movement in the wake of traumatic injury? And a lot of that connected back to the idea of yang shen, which is something that's certainly a classical idea. There was a mention of Dr. Wang Zhuye and applied channel theory, and Dr. Wang Zhuye talks a lot about yang shen, the maintenance of healthy flow of qi through the channels as a long-term healthy concept. And a lot of the research really focused more on that level rather than on the end product of the actual neuroplastic and neurogenic production. Now, from there, I have continued, like I said, 5 years have passed. So I'm going to very briefly, I wanted to focus mostly on the research that was done because that's obviously the focus of the symposium, but I did want to share with you guys some of what I've done since then. I have since then moved just away from the neurophysiology into the realm of cognitive sciences and the idea of Shin as a virtual machine. Moved more extensively into the idea of memory in the 5 phases, and then the relation of East Asian medical ontology and PTSD, largely because cognitive sciences is a place where they have a similar sort of soft science ontology in and around it, but they have started connecting very directly to neurophysiology and neuropsychology. So that has been a very useful realm to explore because they have done a lot of the legwork for me in connecting some of the cognitive processes that we can explain via Shin pathologies within our medical practices and the physiology, because they have already tied some of those cognitive processes to the neurophysiology driving that. And a lot of this has been around looking at the 3 treasures and the breakdown of the Cartesian divide. I've got our buddy Rene Descartes over there on the right. I think, therefore I am. And the move away from Cartesian dualism and more towards materialism, the idea that the mind can, to some degree, be explained by the body and by the neurophysiology. And that's a lot of the work that's being done at this point, at least for me and by me. Is really looking at those materialist concepts of how do we use the physiology and particularly the functional physiology to explain these processes using the idea that Shin and Qi and Jing are the same. If I can explain the mind, I can explain the body. And if I can explain the body, then I can explain the mind. And certainly I'll give you my email at the end. And if you want to talk some more about that, please I can go on basically forever, and I would love other people's ideas. One of the other interesting areas of research that I'll touch on briefly is the relationship of psychotropics versus East Asian medicine. I did start looking at a case study, a prospective case study research that I was looking at doing with an EMDR therapist, looking at the treatment of PTSD using EMDR and E-stim acupuncture as a parallel to the research that's now being done on psychotropics, particularly psilocybin and ketamine, and its effects on creating neuroplasticity and depersonalization for therapeutic effect. And by looking at those, there are, again, a lot of neurophysiological parallels between the neuropsychiatric as well as the neurophysiological impact of psychotropics and their function and East Asian medicine. And we looking at some of, again, the depersonalization and the visual hallucination aspects of that in relation to the Hun and the Shen and the Wood phase in general. And a lot of those can be stimulated by breathing. So again, tying back in that metal phase in the lung. And a lot of that can be triggered, again, also by E-stim acupuncture. You can create a lot of psychotropic effects with some E-stim scalp acupuncture. And again, we were working on an initial prospective case study process to begin researching that. And then COVID came and basically shut us down. So we haven't moved forward with that. But hopefully that's pending. So there is still work going on with this. I did not simply rest on my laurels so I could talk to you wonderful people and then go, look how smart I am. But thank you for all of that. We've got about 5 minutes in case anyone does have any questions. That is my email address, as I mentioned. I'm currently working as the academic dean for Texas Health and Science University, so I can be reached there. But please, if anyone has any questions, let me know. I see Robin's lovely faces pop back up, so I'm assuming she is looking at the chat box and will let me know if anybody has questions about my endless chain of gobbledygook that I just shotgunned at you as fast as possible.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Phillips? Andrea says it's a nice blend of old and new techniques. Dr. Chuang says great, cool research. I think you should talk with Donna from VUIM because I know in hers she found some random controlled trials on E-stim. Okay, we have a question from Sean. What herbs were best for the memory that you found?
So that is a little bit lateral to what I was looking at. Because while I was looking at memory and cognitive processes, the research that I did in this particular scoping study was specifically on the neurophysiology of actual neuronal formation, not just hippocampal learning and memory, but in sort of a broader context. That being said, the herbs that were referenced most frequently in terms of some of the cognitive decline research I looked at, really, the two things I saw referenced probably most frequently, well, the three things really, was Rinchen, good old ginseng, Shu Di Huang, as I mentioned, came up in a lot, which of course nourishes qi, nourishes blood, as well as nourishes essence. Sometimes substituted for Sheng Di Huang, particularly when there was some neuroinflammation because of the heat clearing aspect. And then last but not least was Chuanshang. Now, Chuanshang has some very fascinating aspects. I'll try to talk quick because I know I'm running out of time and I don't want to make the next presenter late. But Chuanshang has some fascinating aspects and also comes up a lot in neuro-oncology because Chuanshang has some really fascinating impacts on the blood-brain barrier. In terms, and certainly it's one of our most common herbs used for headache, particularly minstrelly driven headache. But a lot of that headache has to do, again, with cerebrovascular perfusion, which has a lot to do with memory and learning, because of course, without vascular perfusion, there can be no neurological proliferation. Got to have blood to have nerves, as well, again, as that impact on blood-brain barrier. And I think the presence of Chuanshang often came up because when we're working on this neurological architecture, if we can't get constituent components across the BBB, it doesn't matter how good my herb is, it doesn't do anything. And Chuanshang had such a great impact on that. So those were three herbs that came up a lot. Now, I do know from some other research that Yuan Hu Shuo comes up a lot for students will pound that pre-test because of that idea of opening the orifices of the mind. I don't know if it's pre-test placebo effect, but I have had a lot of students that tell me that they took that pre-tests and felt like they did better. That's very anecdotal, but I'll put that out there. I happen to know background information that Sean may occasionally have to study for tests, so I'll throw that out there as a bonus. Any other? Yeah, absolutely, Sean. Any other questions?
Ningjiang asks, do you think neuroplasticity is a passive process or active process to the patient?
I think we would have to clarify that question a little bit in that obviously I cannot like close my eyes and squint real hard and make neuroplasticity happen. That being said, what we do know is there are active things the patient can do that will increase neuroplasticity. For instance, attending doctoral research symposiums, things that engage active learning, but in particular, novel proprioceptive learning, again, the Tai Chi, the ballroom dancing, the juggling, those things have really been demonstrated to increase neuroplasticity, which actually I see, I've got the chat pulled up. I do see there was a question about that research. Christy, let me have you email me. I'll type my email in the chat box again. Let me have you email me rather than, because I don't know that that's linked directly. So let me have you email me. I'd be happy to email you my various sources and references about that as well as anything else. Thank you, Robin. Dr. Sodders, Dr. Sodders. But yes, I'm happy. And I do have some extensive research about the breathing as well as some of the hypnagogic breathing, the hypnotropic breathing and some things like that that are really fascinating. I'm happy to share all of that with you. So just email me afterwards. And I think I am fresh out of time, so I will. But if anyone has any other questions, please email me.
Yes, if you want